Should I write a unit test for a repository class? That's such a common question, and today I will share with you what I think about it. I decided to record this video because I came across this question on Reddit. Should I write a unit test for a repository class? And let's dig into the question. Let's see what I will do on this case and what's my opinion regarding writing unit tests for a repository class. Let's start by taking a look into the question. According to the author, he has a repository class that is being called from the controller, but that is not the important part. If we take a look into the implementation itself, there are some things that we can find here. The first one is that is using entity framework. And besides that, we can see that the implementation that was used here of the repository pattern is not a generic repository. So it's a concrete implementation for this type. We can see it through the names as well. There are a few things here that could be improved, like naming or using the cancellation token as an example, but that's not the topic of the video. Before we keep going, let me tell you something, and you don't want to skip this, otherwise you will regret it so much. Have you heard about NDC conferences? I think so. So you might know that NDC conferences are amazing. There's a lot of great speakers there. It's an excellent event. And the good news is that the NDC team was kindly enough to offer me a ticket that I can give away to one of you. And the ticket is a 3-day conference pass for free for NDC Porto 2024. So if you want to come to Porto, if you want to be there with me and other excellent speakers, the only thing that you need to do is to go to the link in the description, leave your email there, and in September I will run the giveaway to find out who's the lucky winner. And if you are that person, we can meet in Porto in October. So go there, leave your email there, and then please make sure that you say thanks to NDC for this opportunity. Now, let's get back to the video. The other thing that we see here is that to return data from the database, we have two ways to do it. One is to get a single entity using the ID. The other one will return a list of it. So as you can see, this is a typical generic implementation, but on this case, this class is specific to that type. So let's focus on the question from the author. He's asking if it should write a unit test for this case. So that would mean that he wants to test something like, can I call the method add gender and that will add to the context, and I call the save changes and everything is fine, things like that. But when we think about it, we know that his unit test would be something like, you will have something like the repo, and for the repo, you would need to create a new repository. But to create that repository here, what's expected here currently is the DB context. So that means that if I inject here the DB context using the real database, it's no longer a unit test. I could do it with the in-memory implementation of the DB context, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I want to step back and talk about why do you need a repository and if do you need a repository in this case. For that, it's worthy to first talk about why do we need repositories, okay? Originally, repositories were created with a single responsibility. And that responsibility would be to mediate the relationship between the domain of your application. So you'll have the domain, and you want to mediate the relationship with the data mapping. So the repository that would stay here would act like a collection accessor that would be an abstraction over the data mapping. And that is worthy when you have a lot of complexity going on here. And what does that mean? It means that, for example, you might have complexity around querying, okay? Complex queries going on, complex mapping going on. So you would come up with the repo for that. Let's think about an example. Imagine that you are getting from the database something like master detail structure. Like imagine an invoice, the invoice as lines, okay? And you want to get that from the database. That might mean depending on the way that you are fetching data from the database. That might mean that you need to perform several queries, you need to map to different objects, and you might need to apply some conditions. You might do a lot of things that just to go from something like the SQL to the object that you have in your domain. So the repo would be an abstraction for that. An abstraction that will let you to swap that data mapping if you need, that might help you if you want to swap the place where you are getting the data from. So if we translate this concept to something that we are familiar with, like domain-centric architectures like clean architecture or hexagonal architecture, we can say that in the center of our application, we have our domain. And around here in the edges, we'll have something like a database. And we want to have an abstraction to make sure that that domain is not polluted and depending on that database. And the repo would be one way of coming up with that abstraction. And usually those repositories would follow the same logic, the same structure. It would be kind of like, I'm working on top of a collection. Looks like you are working on top of a list. And I can add things to the list, I can update things on the list, I can delete, I can get things from the list. So from the domain perspective, it's kind of like if you are working with a simple in-memory collection. But the implementation might mean that you are going from collection to a structure in a file, in a database, whatever. So let's recenter this. If we look into this code that we can see on the post, we can see the following. We can see that we have a repo that is using EF. I'm not sure if this thing is EF core or other thing, but that doesn't matter for the fact. The interesting thing here is that EF already exposes you an abstraction from the database. You can swap the place where data is coming from if you want. So the way that Entity Framework works, I can say that this thing is working with SQL. I can say it's Postgres. I can say it's in memory, for example. That means that I have here kind of like a middleman when in fact that repo, by looking to that code, is not having value. So I can confidently say that in this specific case, the repository is not having value to the problem. So I could remove it because this entity framework is in fact my repo. But now you might ask, what if I have here something like a complex query? Something like, in this case, I'm using the ID, I'm getting all, but imagine that I want to filter that data. I need to have ways to, okay, now I want to get the entity only if the status is active. Now I want to get the entity only if the date of creation is after a given date. Now I want to get by the name. Now I want to get by the author. So one thing that tends to happen when you have repositories like this one is that eventually you have several get methods. So a get something method. And you add one, you add another one, you add another one, you add another one, and eventually you have a ton of them. But by doing this in this way, you are in fact breaking the single responsibility principle, because now that repository has too many responsibilities. So one strategy that you can use is not the topic of this video, but if you want to avoid this, is to use something that the name is specification pattern. And if you would like to see a video on the specification pattern, please let me know on the comments and I'm happy to do it. Another reason that you might think about to have a repo on top of the entity framework is, what if I have the same query? Imagine you perform given link statements multiple times in different places that are using entity framework for that entity, and I want to deduplicate that. So how can I achieve that? One simple way of doing it, if in fact you have that, is that you can bring something as simple as an extension methods. Okay, you can have an extension method to do something like, I want to get this entity filtered by the created date. And this way you remove that code duplication. That is the thing that you are concerned. So now that we discussed why we use repositories, why do we think about bringing repositories on top of entity framework, let's think about the scenario of unit testing or testing in general. So as we have seen moments ago, there's no value on having this on our source code because our entity framework is in fact our repo. And also there's no value on building unit tests on top of this because here there's nothing special happening. It's kind of like if I'm simply forwarding instructions into entity framework. If I throw this repo away and EF is now my repo, should I unit test it? Okay. So what would it mean to unit test entity framework? To unit test entity framework, according to the definition that I use for a unit test, that is, a test is not a unit test if it will go across the network, if it touches the database, if accesses to something like the file system, those type of things. So the only way to make entity framework working as part of a unit test, in my opinion, is by using something like the in-memory provider. So before you start arguing with me that that is not a unit test, let me tell you something. By using the in-memory provider, the test will continually run in a bubble, in isolation, okay? Because the in-memory provider is in fact acting like a testable. There's a lot of similarities on the way that the in-memory provider will work with something that we can create, a type of testable that is a fake. So for me, if you use the in-memory provider, you can still have a unit test. But if I unit test directly this entity framework, I don't gain anything. Why? The same way that I don't test methods from the framework like the math class, the task class, those type of methods, I will not test entity. It's a solid project. It's a project that I trust. It's a project with quality. I can go and see it's being well tested. So there's no reason for doing that. But now we can push the question to a different place. If we go back into our question, we can see that according to the author, the repo that, if we refactor this to avoid this repo, would be the entity framework, will be used directly inside of this controller. So our controller uses EF. Okay. Now let's ask, can I unit test the controller? So the answer is yes, if you use the EF in memory. So there's no need to create an abstraction on top of EF because you can still use this, in my opinion. And that might be useful to test specific logic inside of that controller. Then what about the access to the database itself? If I want to test that, if I want to perform a test that in fact goes to the database and comes back something like, let me run a test that adds something into this table and then I can update it, I can get it, and I can check that data is what I expect. On that case, you can use an integration test. And on that case, instead of using the in-memory, you would use the EF with the real provider, so the one that you are targeting to. And how can you put this in place? You can do it with something like test containers. That is something that you can see how to put in place in this video right here. And if there's any concept that I mentioned during this video that you still have doubts, please let me know in the comments. Would you use this repository or not with entity framework? Would you unit test it? I would love to hear from you.